Becoming Qualitative Researchers. An Introduction. Corinne Glesson. Ways of Knowing, Paradigms of Research. Paradigms are frameworks that function as maps or guides for scientific communities, determining important problems or issues for its members to address, and defining acceptable theories or explanations, methods, and techniques to solve defined problems. The concept of research paradigms grew out of work by Thomas Kuhn, who published The Structure of Scientific Revolutions in 1962. Kuhn, trained as a theoretical physicist, had a strong interest in philosophy. While a doctoral candidate, he became intrigued by how history informed the philosophy of science. The book that resulted from this exploration began a philosophical revolution in the practice of science. Before its publication, Western scientists tended to believe that research built upon itself, progressively increasing a body of knowledge. Referred to as logical positivism, this paradigm held that knowledge was limited to what could be logically deduced from theory, operationally measured, and empirically replicated. Although science, at the time, was viewed as objective, neutral, and value-free, Kuhn demonstrated how science was often an ideological battleground where ideas and explanations competed, and those that won tended to be those of the scientists with the most power. From Kuhn and others came the argument that data and observations are theory-led, that theory is paradigm-led, and that paradigms are historically and culturally located. A paradigm, then, is a framework or philosophy of science that makes assumptions about the nature of reality and truth, the kinds of questions to explore, and how to go about doing so. The word ontology is often used to refer to beliefs regarding reality or what kinds of things make up the world. Ontology, states Potter, is the concern about whether the world exists and, if so, in what form. You might think of the world as one of matter, for example, things you can observe and measure. Or you might see the world as more shaped by the mind, by how the mind perceives, categorizes, and interprets things. What you believe about the nature of reality, in turn, affects the kinds of questions you ask of it, what you consider knowledge to be. Epistemology is the word used to refer to the study of the nature of knowledge. What you believe knowledge to be, in turn, shapes and serves to justify your methodology, your theoretical perspectives about how to go about knowing. Every research study, therefore, is informed by philosophical and theoretical assumptions, even though researchers sometimes are not aware of these influences because they are embedded in the researcher's suppositions about the nature of reality and knowledge. Part of your duty as a researcher is to figure out what philosophical and theoretical perspectives inform the kind of work you choose to do. This introduction is meant to initiate that process, but it is only a beginning. Some sources to help you become more familiar with the thought and language of philosophical and theoretical perspectives that inform research are suggested at the end of this chapter. For ease of discussion, I classify the philosophical frameworks that guide the work of social scientists into 4 paradigmatic families: post-empiricism, interpretivism, critical theory, and post-structuralism. Each should be viewed as loosely bounded and as containing several related schools of thought. They are not rigid, well-defined categories. These paradigms have developed and changed over time, influenced by socio-historical contexts as well as by thought of scholars from within their own traditions and from other paradigms. To complicate matters, different researchers and authors use different labels for the paradigms, and some labels get associated with various paradigms. Nor is there agreement among social scientists on how many paradigms there are or on how associated methodologies should be divided. My purpose in using the categories proposed here is as a heuristic for making clearer the ways in which research is ensconced in belief systems that offer different purposes for doing research and different ways of making meaning. The term positivism came from Auguste Comte, a 19th-century French philosopher who advocated modeling research in the social sciences on that used in the natural sciences to create an approach that would be positive in its attempts to achieve reliable, concrete knowledge on which we could act to change the social world for the better. Social scientists from many disciplines applied positivist methods and concepts to their research. By the 1930s and 1940s, however, the ontology on which logical positivism was built, that a fixed reality existed that could be measured and known, had received much criticism. Most who work within this paradigm today would agree that the world is not knowable with certainty, and they accept that measurement is fallible. They also grant that complete objectivity is not possible and that all researchers are biased by their historical contexts and sociocultural experiences. Nonetheless, they continue to use and value procedures and language associated with the scientific method, and to assert that research can reveal close enough objective facts to assist in making generalizations and predictions regarding social behavior. This modification of positivism is sometimes referred to as post-positivism. The term post-positivism is used by others to indicate all paradigmatic frameworks that have developed since logical positivism held sway. To avoid this confusion, I am using post-empiricism to refer to the modified way of viewing science and inquiry that came after the demise of the strict empiricism of logical positivism. As a post-empiricist, your ontological beliefs will include a reality external to people that can be measured and apprehended to some degree of accuracy. Because the world is at least approximately knowable, you'll seek to do research in order to make generalizations about social phenomena, to provide explanations about their causes, and to create predictions concerning those phenomena. You will work to gain this knowledge through observations that are as objective as possible, measurements, and carefully designed experiments. Your research methods generally will begin with a theory about the phenomena in question. Using that theory, you will pose several hypotheses, and then test your hypotheses through methods designed to be objective and to keep you removed from subjects to avoid, as much as possible, you're influencing their behavior and responses. The data you collect will be reduced to numerical indices or quantifiable bits of information and will be analyzed statistically. These procedures tend to be called quantitative methods. Interpretivism. Although ideas found in interpretivism can be traced back to Greek and Roman philosophies, interpretivism as a form of social science research grew out of the work of 18th-century German philosopher Immanuel Kant and was expanded on by Wilhelm Dilthey, Max Weber, Edmund Husserl, and others. These philosophers are referred to as idealists in that, unlike realists, who believe a world exists independently of the knower, idealists believe that the world cannot exist independently of the mind, or of ideas. An idealist does not necessarily hold that the natural and social worlds are unreal or non-existent, but that there is no direct understanding of the world. Rather, the world must be interpreted. This interpretive theory of human understanding is sometimes referred to as hermeneutics. It rejects the idea of universal laws and accepts that interpretation is fundamental to human interactions and knowing. The role of the social scientist then becomes accessing others' interpretations of some social phenomenon and of interpreting, themselves, others' actions and intentions. Many different traditions of interpretivism have developed. German Edmund Husserl, for example, elaborated on the philosophies of Immanuel Kant to develop his philosophy of phenomenology. In the late 19th and the 20th centuries, other prominent thinkers, such as Alfred Schutz, Hans-Georg Gadamer, and George Herbert Mead, further developed phenomenological theory. As the ideas of interpretivism took hold in different disciplines and in various geographic locations, they grew and developed in ways that met diverse needs and interests. For example, ethnomethodology and symbolic interactionism grew as methodologies in sociology for interpreting aspects of everyday life, while, in anthropology, ethnography developed as the way of understanding and interpreting culture. All, however, share the goal of understanding human ideas, actions, and interactions in specific contexts or in terms of the wider culture. The ontological belief that tends to accompany interpretive traditions, therefore, portrays a world in which reality is socially constructed, complex, and ever-changing. What is of importance to know is how people interpret and make meaning of some object, event, action, perception, and so on. These constructed realities are viewed as existing, however, not only in the mind of the individual, but also as social constructions, in that individualistic perspectives interact with the thought and language of the wider society. Thus, accessing the perspectives of several members of the same social group about some phenomena can suggest some cultural patterns of thought and action for that group as a whole. With the research goal of interpreting the social world from the perspectives of those who are actors in that world, it follows that the research methods include interacting with people in their social contexts and talking with them about their perceptions. If your philosophical framework is interpretivism, your study design will tend to focus on in-depth, long-term interactions with relevant people in one or several sites. Although site-specific hypotheses may be a result of your study, you probably will begin not with them, but with a mindset that is exploratory and open to the variety of perspectives and issues that might arise. You observe, ask questions, and interact with research participants. You may look for patterns in your analyses, but you do not try to reduce the multiple interpretations to numbers, nor to a norm. Your final write-up will be quite descriptive in nature. These methods tend to be called qualitative, because some of you may be more familiar with post-empiricist traditions of research and are trying to figure out exactly how interpretive traditions differ. I have included Figure 1.2. The differences suggested should be taken not as hard and fast distinctions, but as predispositions of the different inquiry approaches. Critical theory. Critical theory research takes you beyond describing what is, which is the intention of interpretivists, and toward describing what could be. In critical theory, the term critical refers to the detecting and unmasking of beliefs and practices that limit human freedom, justice, and democracy. Critical theory research critiques historical and structural conditions of oppression and seeks transformation of those conditions. Critical theory research is guided by a historical realism ontology, that life is a virtual reality shaped by social, political, cultural, economic, ethnic, and gender values crystallized over time. A central concept in critical theory research is that ideologies work to distort reality. The role of critical theorists is to reveal and critique these distorting ideologies and the associated structures, mechanisms, and processes that help to keep them in place. In particular, they work to situate the experiences and perspectives of the oppressed group in a social, historical context, revealing how conditions serve certain groups and not others. See Denzin, Lincoln, and Smith for numerous examples. Critical theory researchers often make use of standpoint epistemologies. Standpoint epistemologies are positioned in the experiences, values, and interests of a group that has traditionally been oppressed or excluded. From those standpoints, researchers critique and reconstruct narratives of dominant groups, exposing ways in which they have been racist, masculinist, straight, Eurocentric, and so forth. Two examples of standpoint epistemologies are critical race theory and queer theory. Critical race theory focuses on ways in which racism is so embedded in society that it appears normal for many, and it portrays race as a socially constructed means to identify and classify people. With emphasis on social and political forms of power, critical race theory looks at how power both includes and excludes people of color. Queer theory challenges the concept of heteronormativity, the perspective that heterosexuality should be the normal way for interactions. Similar to the treatment of the concept of race in critical race theory, queer theory views heterosexuality as a social construct and works to bring under suspicion any views considered normal by dominant society. Although critical theory research does not follow any particular set of methods, a few general aspects of research design are characteristic. First, critical theory researchers see research as a political act because it not only relies on value systems, but challenges value systems. Critical theory research tends to focus on issues of power and domination and to advocate understanding from the perspective of the exploited and oppressed. Second, critical theory researchers often focus upon language or the tacit rules that regulate what can and cannot be said, who can speak with the blessings of authority and who must listen, whose social constructions are valid and whose are erroneous and unimportant. As a result, their interests lie in exposing ways in which discourses are socially and historically constructed and how these discourses support and maintain conditions of inequality, oppression, and exploitation. Third, critical theory researchers are often interested in praxis, or the relationships between thought and action, theory and practice. Some incorporate dialogue and critical reflection as part of the research process in an effort to reveal unexamined assumptions among participants and the ways in which people may be accepting explanations of the dominant cultural group that serve to oppress. This process enables people to challenge learned restrictions, compulsions, or dictates of habit and can point the way to changing current relationships or structures. Weiss and Fine provide engaging examples of the possibilities associated with critical research. They demonstrate how research can go beyond description to reveal ways in which certain groups are subjugated, and then to raise awareness among participants in those processes. In one of their studies, Weiss and Fine created research camps for New York City high school students from a variety of identities. In the camps, students learned about critical race theory as well as research methods. The students created a school survey, administered it, and then analyzed and interpreted the data. Using critical race theory, Weiss and Fine urged students to look at ways in which dominant perspectives were perpetuated through their own analyses and at how certain groups got silenced in the process. For many of the students, the work was empowering as they gained authority and confidence to speak out about school inequities and societal injustice. Feminist theory can guide research in each of the paradigms, but feminist research is often allied with critical theory research. An underlying assumption in critical feminist work is the belief that women experience oppression and exploitation, and that this experience varies, considering the multiple identities each person holds. Like critical theory researchers in general, critical feminist researchers focus on issues of justice and power and are committed to uncovering and understanding the forces that cause and sustain oppression. They hold as a primary focus of their work the transformation of asymmetrical power relations, particularly as applied to women. This does not mean, however, that the focus is exclusively on gender, because gender oppression is not experienced or structured in isolation from other oppressions. Rather, women's identities are understood as intersectional, making it imperative that consideration and analysis of race, class, culture, ethnicity, sexual preference, and other identities play a primary role in feminist research. Beginning with the topic for research, the feminist position is that research with women must first ask research questions that are of interest and importance to women. Second, the most critical components of feminist methodology, and perhaps its most distinguishing features, are the concern for the research relationship and the enlargement of the definition of rapport in the fieldwork process. The feminist researcher acknowledges that a relationship exists with each participant in a study and works to honor those relationships. Third, feminist researchers advocate critical self-reflections on their own roles as researchers and on their histories, values, and assumptions in relationship to the research. Feminist researchers extend their attention to interactions among researcher and participants and to the role power and authority might play in the research process. Fourth, feminist researchers tend to position themselves in the inquiry process as activist scholars, committing themselves to using their privileged positions and research for social justice ends, particularly on behalf of those most disadvantaged. Feminist research has made lasting changes in how qualitative inquiry in general is conducted. Because feminist researchers sought to create less hierarchical and collaborative research relationships, researchers in other paradigms revised their perspectives on ways to be with research participants and began asking new questions about how the nature of research relationships affected inquiry. The focus by feminists on interrogating their own actions, interactions, power, and authority in the research process has also contributed to general discussions of reflexivity in research and its expected incorporation into most forms of qualitative inquiry. To complicate matters and also to reiterate that these paradigmatic categorizations leak into each other and are not static, many contemporary critical and feminist scholars have moved in the direction of post-structuralist thinking in their work. Just what this may mean is discussed in the next section. Postmodernism, postcolonialism, poststructuralism. The term postmodernity indicates a break from modernity, a historical period of time marked, in part, by industrialization. Characteristics of modernity included a belief in formal logic as necessary for reason, the bureaucratization of society, and a belief in science and technology as means to solving problems. Postmodernity is marked by globalization, the spread of information technologies, and the fragmentation of nation-states. Under postmodernism, the grand theories that have been relied upon as explaining how societies work and how people develop and interact are subjected to critique and distrust. Schwant, 1997, page 120. Mostly because, as Sokolowski states, it has become more and more clear that the heart of the modern project is not the exercise of reason in the service of knowledge, but the exercise of a will, the will to rule, the will to power. Page 202. Postmodernism argues that there are no universal truths to be discovered, because all human investigators are grounded in human society and can only produce partial locally and historically specific insights. Rather than questions about causality, as with post-empiricists, or meaning, as with interpretivists. Concepts that are relevant to postmodernism include plurality, fragmentation, and indeterminacy. The paradigm of inquiry that is informed by postmodern thought is variably referred to as postmodern, poststructural, postcolonial, and postfortist, among other terms. These traditions can be distinguished from each other and yet share similar perspectives or philosophies, and the terms are used, therefore, somewhat interchangeably by many. Researchers within these traditions offer a radical critique of the entire fabric of modern Western thinking from both within and outside it. For each, the term post is more than a marker of time. It refers to a break with the past and to the regeneration and reconstellation of new ideas and social practices. Post-colonialism theory has emerged from throughout the world, in previously colonized countries as well as in Europe and the United States. Post-colonialism is concerned with legacies of colonialism and how they work to subjugate entire populations on basis of race and geography. It focuses upon the multiple ways colonialism continues in the everyday lives of people and how it is resisted and challenged. Post-colonialism critiques ways in which Western thinking dominates lives of people throughout the world, and it works to bring the voices of the margins to the center, to displace Western hegemony. Important post-colonial scholars include Edward Said, Gayatri Spivak, Homi Bhabha, and Arjun Appadurai, among others. Much of the thinking regarding post-structuralism emerged out of French intellectual thought, particularly the work of Jacques Derrida and Michel Foucault. Reacting to the social-linguistic work of structuralists who sought underlying linguistic codes or grammars to understand social interactions and cultures, post-structuralists were more interested in how texts resisted order and systematization. Viewing textual productions as not only written words but also speech and human behavior, post-structuralists tend to focus on deconstructing texts, showing how they systematically include and exclude people and ideas. Anything occupying a central position in a society, such as the notions of progress and liberal democracy in the United States, is suspect as discourses of control and power. The post-structuralist works to decentrate and to destabilize such ways of thinking. Because these central discourses are seen as insidious, penetrating most venues of social thought, researchers must interrogate their own beliefs and actions as well. Post-structuralism does not allow us to place the blame elsewhere, outside our own daily activities, but demands that we examine our own complicity in the maintenance of social injustice. The central purpose of these various post-traditions can be described as deconstruction. Jane Flax writes that postmodern discourses are all deconstructive in that they seek to distance us from and make us skeptical about beliefs concerning truth, knowledge, power, the self, and language that are often taken for granted within and serve as legitimation for contemporary Western culture. Elizabeth St. Pierre elaborates that one of the most significant effects of deconstruction is that it foregrounds the idea that language does not simply point to pre-existing things and ideas, but rather helps to construct them and, by extension, the world as we know it. In other words, we word the world. The way it is not natural. We have constructed the world as it is through language and cultural practice, and we can also deconstruct and reconstruct it. The artwork by Albrecht Dürer provides a visual metaphor of how assumptions and prevailing frameworks shape the work that gets done. In Western Europe in the 1400s, paintings were used primarily to communicate religious stories and to pay homage to rulers and donors. Dürer was a German painter, engraver, printmaker, and mathematician who lived from 1471 to 1528. Much of his work was of religious figures and scenes, as was typical of the time. Dürer was, however, at the cusp of change, when the bourgeois were becoming patrons of art along with the aristocrats and the church. These new patrons were interested in new art forms, encouraging Dürer's foray into woodcut prints and watercolor landscapes. Postmodernism, post-structuralism, and post-colonialism challenge every aspect of Western philosophy and science that has developed since the Enlightenment, suggesting that, as with Dürer, we live at another cusp of change.